The summer sun hung heavy over Willow Creek, Tennessee, casting long shadows across the sleepy town, nestled between rolling hills and sprawling farmland. Abigail Monroe stood at the edge of her kitchen, a worn sponge in her hand, scrubbing the counter as if she could erase the quiet that had settled into her life. At 36, she was a woman of routine, ironing Daniel's shirts on Mondays, weeding the tomato patch on Wednesdays, and baking biscuits every Sunday after church. Her two-story home, with its chipped white paint and creaking porch swing, was her sanctuary, a place where she'd raised 2 kids and built a life with her husband. But lately, it felt more like a cage. Daniel Monroe was a good man, the kind of husband who'd once carved her initials into the oak tree out back and kissed her under the stars. Now he was a ghost in their marriage. A sales manager for a trucking company based in Chattanooga, always chasing the next deal. His job kept him on the road for days, sometimes weeks, leaving Abigail with nothing but the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional call from a motel payphone. "Miss you, Abby," he'd say, his voice crackling with exhaustion, promising he'd be home soon. But soon stretched into forever, and the distance between them grew wider than the miles he traveled. Their kids, Caleb and Hannah, were gone too, off at a summer camp in the Smoky Mountains. Abigail had driven them there herself 2 weeks ago, waving as the bus pulled away, their sunburned faces pressed against the windows. She'd smiled then, proud of their independence, but the silence they left behind was deafening. The house echoed with absence. Empty bedrooms, untouched toys, a kitchen table set for one. She didn't mind solitude at first. It gave her space to think, to pray, to keep busy. But now, in the thick of July, the loneliness had sunk its claws deep, wrapping around her heart like kudzu, strangling an old barn. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind where the air felt like a wet blanket, and the cicadas buzzed in a relentless chorus. Abigail stood in her kitchen, the windows flung wide to catch any whisper of a breeze. She'd turned on the old radio perched on the counter, its scratched dials tuned to a country station. Dolly Parton's voice spilled out, warm and twangy, singing about love and heartache. Abigail hummed along, her bare feet tapping the linoleum as she scrubbed. She wore a faded blue sundress, the hem frayed from years of wear, and an apron streaked with flour from a botched biscuit batch earlier. The kitchen smelled of lemons and yeast, a faint comfort against the heat. She swayed to the music, letting it pull her out of herself. For a moment, she wasn't just Abigail Monroe, the wife waiting for her husband, the mother counting days until camp ended. She was young again, spinning in a field with wildflowers in her hair, free from the weight of a life stretched thin. She tossed the sponge into the sink and danced, really danced, her arms swaying, her hips moving to the beat. It was a small rebellion, a stolen joy in a house too quiet for too long. She didn't hear the knock at the door. She didn't hear the crunch of gravel under boots or the faint jingle of keys. She was lost in the song, in the sunlight streaming through the windows, painting golden streaks across the floor. It wasn't until she spun around, mid-twirl, that she saw him. Travis Coleman stood just outside the screen door, his broad frame silhouetted against the glare. Abigail froze, her breath catching like a snag on a rusty nail. Her hands flew to her chest, clutching the apron as if it could shield her from the intrusion. Travis was Daniel's old high school buddy, a mechanic who smelled of gasoline and wore his years in the lines etched around his eyes. He'd borrowed Daniel's chainsaw last week to clear some storm-downed branches, and now here he was, unannounced, peering into her private world. "Abigail." His voice was low, hesitant, cutting through Dolly's chorus. He tipped his faded baseball cap, squinting through the screen. "Didn't mean to scare ya. Knocked a few times, but I guess you were busy." Her cheeks flushed hot, a mix of embarrassment and adrenaline. "Travis! Oh, Lord, I didn't hear you." She stumbled to the door, pushing it open with a shaky hand. Come in, it's hotter than a firecracker out there." He stepped inside, the chainsaw dangling from one calloused hand, his work boots leaving faint dirt smudges on her pristine floor. Up close, she noticed the sweat beading on his brow, the way his grey t-shirt clung to his shoulders, damp from the heat. He set the chainsaw by the door and wiped his hands on his jeans, offering a crooked grin that made her stomach twist in a way she didn't expect. "Figured I'd drop this off," he said, nodding at the tool. "Daniel mentioned that old oak out back's been leaning a little too close to the house." "Oh, right," she said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "He's been meaning to take care of it. Too busy, though. Always too busy." The words slipped out sharper than she intended, laced with a bitterness she hadn't meant to show. Travis nodded, his gaze flickering over her face. "Yeah, he's a hard one to pin down these days. Man's a workhorse." She turned away, needing something to do with her hands. "You want some lemonade? Fresh squeezed this morning." Her voice sounded too bright, too eager, but she couldn't stop it. "Sure, that'd be great." She pulled the pitcher from the fridge, the ice clinking as she poured 2 glasses. Handing one to him, she watched as he settled onto a stool at the kitchen island, his long legs stretched out. The air felt thick, charged with something she couldn't name. She sipped her drink, the tartness sharp on her tongue, and tried to ignore the way her pulse thudded in her ears. Travis was just a friend dropping by, nothing more. "Caught you dancing," he said suddenly, a teasing lilt in his voice that made her choke on her lemonade. "Didn't peg you for the type." She coughed, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "Oh, hush up," she said, laughing despite herself. "Just keeping myself entertained. Gets awful quiet round here with Daniel gone and the kids at camp." "Quiet can wear a soul down," he said, his tone softening. "Sometimes you gotta make your own noise to shake it off." There was a warmth in his words, a kindness that tugged at something deep inside her. She hadn't realized how much she craved a conversation, any human connection, until this moment. They talked easily about the heat, the chainsaw, the time Travis and Daniel got their truck stuck in a mud pit back in '98, laughing until their sides hurt. It was light, unburdened, and for the first time in weeks, Abigail didn't feel like a shadow drifting through her own life. But then the air shifted, subtle as a breeze turning cold. Travis set his glass down, leaning forward on his elbows. "You're different today, Abigail. Lighter, somehow. It's nice to see." Her breath hitched, her fingers tightening around her glass. "I'm just me," she said, but the words sounded hollow, uncertain. "Nah," he countered, his hazel eyes locking with hers. "You're more than that. Always have been. Daniel's a lucky man, but I reckon he don't see it half the time." The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in. Abigail's hands gripped the counter, her wedding band catching the light, a silent reminder of her vows. She should have laughed it off, changed the subject, sent him on his way with a polite goodbye. But something reckless stirred inside her, a hunger born of too many nights alone, of being unseen, unheard. She didn't move as Travis stood, stepping closer, the space between them shrinking to nothing. "Travis!" Her voice was a whisper, a plea, but it died as his hand brushed her arm. The touch was light, tentative, but it sent a shockwave through her, electric and forbidden. "I shouldn't," he murmured, his voice rough with conflict. "But I've always wondered—" Before she could think, before she could stop it, he leaned in. His lips met hers, urgent and desperate, a collision of need and recklessness. For a heartbeat, Abigail was swept away, her hands fisting in his shirt, her body leaning into the heat of him. It was wrong, a betrayal of everything she'd promised, and yet it lit a fire she'd forgotten she could feel. She was wanted, desired, alive in a way she hadn't been in years. But then the world snapped back into focus. Her hands shoved against his chest, breaking the kiss as she stumbled backward. "No, no, we can't!" Her voice cracked, raw with panic. Travis froze, his eyes wide with regret. "Abigail, I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" "Get out," she whispered, tears burning her eyes. "Please, just go." He hesitated, his mouth opening as if to argue, but then he grabbed the chainsaw and bolted for the door. It slammed shut behind him, leaving her alone in the kitchen, the radio still crooning softly. She sank to the floor, her back against the cabinets, sobs tearing from her throat. What had she done? How could she have let it happen? Daniel's face flashed in her mind, his tired smile, his steady hands, and guilt crashed over her like a wave, pulling her under. She stayed there, curled into herself, as the sun climbed higher, the heat pressing against the windows. The kiss replayed in her mind, a torment and a temptation, and she wondered how she'd ever face the mirror again. She'd stood at the edge of a cliff and nearly jumped, and the weight of that truth was more than she could bear. The kitchen floor was cold beneath Abigail Monroe's knees, the linoleum pressing hard against her skin as she huddled there, tears streaking her face. The radio hummed faintly in the background, a cruel mockery of the joy she'd felt just hours ago dancing to its tunes. Travis Coleman's kiss lingered on her lips like a brand, searing her with guilt and something darker, something she didn't dare name. The screen door still rattled faintly from his hurried exit, and the silence that followed was heavier than the July heat pressing against the windows of her Willow Creek home. She didn't move for a long time, her sundress wrinkled and damp with sweat and tears. The chainsaw sat by the door, a silent witness to her fall. She'd pushed Travis away, sent him running, but the damage was done. For that fleeting moment, she'd let herself drown in him. His rough hands, his hungry mouth. And now the shame was a tidal wave, dragging her under. Daniel's face haunted her, his voice echoing from last night's call. "Miss you, Abby?" She'd whispered it back, her heart steady then. Now it pounded with betrayal. Abigail dragged herself to her feet, her legs trembling like a newborn foal's. She stumbled to the sink, splashing cold water on her face, but it couldn't wash away the memory. Her reflection in the window stared back, wild-eyed, flushed, a stranger wearing her skin. Who was she becoming? Daniel was out there, working himself to the bone for their family, and she'd let another man touch her, kiss her, awaken a part of her she'd buried under years of routine. The loneliness that had gnawed at her for months roared now, a beast she couldn't silence. That night, Daniel called again. The phone rang shrill through the empty house, and Abigail's hand shook as she lifted it. "Hey, honey," he said, his voice crackling through the line, tired but warm. "How's my girl holding up?" She pressed her lips together, forcing a smile he couldn't see. "I'm fine," she lied, her throat tight. "Just missing you. When you coming home?" Friday, I hope. Got a big meeting tomorrow, but I'll push through. Miss you too, Abby. His words were a knife, twisting deeper. She mumbled a goodbye and hung up, the receiver clattering back into its cradle. She sank onto the couch, staring at the ceiling, the weight of her secret crushing her chest. Sleep eluded her. She tossed in their bed, the sheets cold without Daniel's warmth. Travis's face flashed in the dark, his hazel eyes, the way they'd softened when he'd said, "You're more than that." She hated how it stirred her, how it made her feel seen when Daniel's absence left her invisible. The loneliness whispered temptations, seductive and dangerous. What if you called him? What if you let it happen again? She pressed her hands over her ears, as if she could block out her own thoughts. But they grew louder, relentless. Days bled into one another, each heavier than the last. Daniel's latest trip stretched into another week, his voice on the phone more distant, his promises thinner. Abigail tried to fill the void, scrubbing floors, weeding the garden, baking bread she didn't eat. But nothing drowned out the chaos in her mind. Travis didn't call, didn't show up, but she saw him everywhere. In the rumble of a truck down the road, in the shadow of the oak tree he'd mentioned. She avoided town, terrified she'd run into him at the gas station or the feed store, his crooked grin unraveling her fragile resolve. The temptation grew claws. One night, alone with a glass of sweet tea on the porch, she imagined driving to his shop, the neon Coleman's Auto sign glowing in the dusk. She pictured his hands on her again, the heat of his breath, the thrill of crossing a line she'd never dared before. Her fingers tightened around the glass, her breath shallow. She was unraveling, teetering on the edge of losing herself completely. Daniel's absence was a void, and Travis was a flame, dangerous, consuming, but so alive. She stood, the tea spilling over her hand, and grabbed her keys before she could think. She was halfway to the truck when she stopped, her bare feet on the gravel, the night air sharp against her skin. What am I doing? She dropped to her knees right there in the driveway, the stones biting into her flesh. Tears came again, hot and fast, and she buried her face in her hands. "God, help me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm lost. I don't know who I am anymore." The prayer was raw, desperate, a plea from a woman drowning in her own weakness. She stayed there until the stars blurred above her, the silence of the night her only answer. Sunday morning dawned grey and heavy, the sky threatening rain. Abigail hadn't planned to go to church. She hadn't felt worthy since that Tuesday, but something pulled her to Willow Creek Baptist. She slipped into a back pew, her sundress swapped for a modest skirt and blouse, her hair pulled tight in a bun. The sanctuary smelled of polished wood and hymnals, the congregation murmuring softly as the organ played. She bowed her head, hiding from the familiar faces, the whispers of, "How's Daniel?" She couldn't bear to answer. The preacher, a wiry man with a voice like thunder, took the pulpit. His sermon sliced through the fog in her mind. Temptation ain't a stranger to any of us. It creeps in when we're weak, when we're alone, whispering lies about what we deserve. But the Lord sees you, child. He knows your struggle. And he's holding out a hand if you'll take it. Grace ain't earned, it's given. His words hit her like a hammer, cracking the shell she'd built around her heart. Tears spilled down her cheeks, soaking her clasped hands as she prayed silently. "Lord, I've sinned. I've been weak, selfish. Show me the way back. Save me from myself." The congregation sang Amazing Grace, and Abigail's voice joined theirs, trembling but sure. She felt a shift, a quiet peace threading through the guilt. It wasn't absolution, not yet, but a lifeline, a promise that she could climb out of the pit she'd dug. When the service ended, she lingered, kneeling at the altar as the church emptied. "Give me strength," she whispered. "Help me honor my vows, my family." The rain began to fall outside, a soft patter against the stained glass, and she stood lighter than she'd been in days. That afternoon, she made a decision. She couldn't carry this alone, couldn't let it fester. She picked up the phone, her fingers steady as she dialed Travis's number. He answered on the first ring, his voice tentative. "Abigail?" "We need to talk," she said, her tone firm. "Meet me at Millie's Diner on Main, 30 minutes. He was there when she arrived, sitting in a corner booth, his baseball cap twisted in his hands. The diner smelled of coffee and fried onions, the jukebox playing a low tune. Abigail slid into the seat across from him, her spine straight, her resolve a shield. Travis looked older in the fluorescent light, shadows under his eyes, his jaw tight with unease. "Abigail, he started, but she held up a hand. "Let me talk first." She took a deep breath, meeting his gaze. "What happened can't happen again. I'm married, Travis. I love Daniel, even if he's gone more than he's here. I got lost that day, lonely, stupid, weak, but I'm not that woman. I've prayed on it, and God's shown me what's right. We need to end this, whatever it is, right here." He nodded, swallowing hard. "I know. I crossed a line. I'm sorry, Abigail. Never meant to hurt you or him. He paused, rubbing a hand over his face. "I saw you dancing, and it hit me how much you deserve to be seen. But you're right. It ain't mine to give." "There's something between us," she admitted, the words raw. "I felt it too, but it's not ours to take. I've got a family, a life I won't throw away, and you've got your own path. We let it go, starting now." Travis looked down, his fingers tracing the brim of his cap. "You're stronger than you think," he said quietly. "I'll keep my distance, promise." They shook hands, awkward, final, across the table, a pact sealed in the hum of the diner. Abigail stood, leaving $1 for the coffee she hadn't touched, and walked out into the rain. It soaked her blouse, but she didn't care. She drove home, the preacher's words echoing, "Grace ain't earned, it's given." She'd stumbled, nearly fallen, but faith had caught her, pulled her back from the edge. Friday came, and Daniel's truck rumbled into the driveway at dusk. He stepped out, weary but smiling, his duffel slung over his shoulder. Abigail met him at the door, throwing her arms around him with a fierceness that surprised them both. "I've missed you," she said, her voice thick, meaning it more than ever. He hugged her back, his laughter warm against her ear. "Missed you too, Abby. What's gotten into you?" "Just glad you're home," she said, pulling back to look at him. His face was lined with exhaustion, but his eyes were hers, steady, familiar. She didn't tell him about Travis. That burden was hers to carry, a scar she'd bear in silence. But she vowed then, with his arms around her, to fight for them, to bridge the gap his absence had carved, to rediscover the love that had built this life. Travis faded into memory, a shadow she'd never chase again. The loneliness lingered, a quiet ache, but it no longer ruled her. She'd stood at the brink and turned back, guided by a hand greater than her own. That night, as Daniel slept beside her, she stood in the kitchen, the radio humming softly. She swayed to the music, not for escape, but for herself, for her family, for the grace that had saved her. The oak tree loomed outside, still leaning, but she'd face it with Daniel tomorrow. Together.